Hello, welcome. This is the Backpack Journalism panel, if that's the one that you were hoping to come to. It is regarding our recent program in Germany. We have a panel that includes one professor and 4 students, and so I'm going to introduce them all, and then I'm going to explain a little bit about our program, just so you have the context for what these guys are going to be talking about. I should probably just introduce myself. My name's Alison Boggs. I'm a scholarly assistant professor here at the Murrow College, focusing mostly on journalism, and I also oversee the Backpack Journalism program. So at the far end, we have Dr. Raymond's son. He's an associate professor of history at WSU who teaches and researches on the world wars, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, contemporary genocides, and the memory of traumatic events. He's also currently completing a project called the Fallen Cougars Project, which is a digital memorial to what was then Washington State College and their 250 war dead from World War II. Brooke Bovenkamp is a senior studying broadcast news and opera performance. She hopes to pursue an on-air career following graduation, specifically as a foreign correspondent. She works as a producer at Northwest Public Broadcasting and is chief financial officer for the WSU's student-run TV station. Jasmine Halleck is a senior studying multimedia journalism with an emphasis on sports communication. Before coming here, she was at Moorpark College and worked as a staff reporter on the Moorpark Reporter. She has an interest in athletics and media production and aims to connect audiences through the love of sports. Reno Probert is a senior studying broadcast production with a minor in digital technology and culture. He enjoys writing and reporting about people's passions, whether it's social justice or a niche hobby. Prior to coming to WSU as a student, Reno was a manager at WSU's foundation. And lastly, Lauren Rendall is a senior multimedia journalism student who has done a lot of reporting on small towns and piecing together stories about how state policies affect people. She's been a legislative intern for the Spokesman Review in Spokane and is copy chief at the Daily Evergreen, which is WSU's student newspaper. So those are our panelists. Could you please welcome our panelists? All right. This is going to be a little different from the average panel just because I really need to give you guys some background about backpack journalism and this project before we launch into questions for the panelists. Backpack Journalism is a donor-funded, competitive, international reporting program for some of our best students. For the students selected, it is like a scholarship. They travel free of cost to an international locale to report stories under the guidance of a faculty member. Past programs have traveled to Serbia, Kenya, Mexico, Argentina, Armenia, and other locations. The goal is to publish student stories upon the return, and the students are selected through a competitive process. After they're selected in the fall, during spring semester, we meet weekly to prepare for the journey. And that includes research, advanced interviews, story planning, and logistical preparation. This year, knowing that it was the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, we decided to visit the former Buchenwald concentration camp, which is now the largest memorial of its kind in Germany, seeing up to 500,000 visitors per year. The goal was to do stories about the 80th anniversary of the liberation, which is on April 11. But we also have a somewhat unique connection. The namesake of our college, who you guys are all familiar with by now, Edward R. Murrow, delivered one of the most famous and influential reports on Buchenwald a few days after its liberation, and it was the first time millions of Americans and many other people around the world learned of the atrocities that were committed in all of the camps. The goal was to report stories that drew upon this history while also marking the 80th anniversary of the camp's liberation. We were very fortunate early on to connect with Dr. Sun, who I call a friend of the Murrow College, and he is an expert on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And we also reached out to Buchenwald, and we were fortunate to connect with Holger Obarius. Actually, I can show you a picture of Holger, too. There. Who is the Director of Education at the Memorial. And working with both Mr. Obarius and Dr. Sun, we conducted multiple Zoom meetings during January and February to prepare for this project. And so it was a heck of an education. I think you would all agree. We traveled over spring break and spent the weekend in Berlin visiting the Holocaust Memorial there along with other sites. And then we also met with and interviewed German journalists. Then we took the train to Weimar, Germany, and we stayed on site at the memorial in an educational center that was a former SS barracks. We stayed there for 4 days, and we toured every part of the memorial. The students interviewed multiple people, gathered copious amounts of images and footage. They also interviewed other visitors who were staying there at the time. And all the students have produced reports in various formats, and we're in the process of pitching those stories to media outlets right now, actually, and we have some very promising prospects for that. So that's the background on it, okay? Sorry to use up so much of the time on that, but I feel like we all kind of need to have that context before we launch into the questions. So the first question I'd like to pose to the panelists is, many of the former concentration camps that we've heard about are now museums or memorials, and Buchenwald is the largest one in Germany, as I said, seeing 500,000 visitors per year. How do you guys describe the way that the staff there approaches their educational mission?
I think, honestly, one of the most impressive things about Buchenwald is how seriously they take that educational mission. Like, every staff member is vetted to an extreme degree. Everyone has a great deal of knowledge, and they really try to combat any type of misinformation or things that someone might come into that situation with that sort of education. And it's actually, they actually have, when they have groups come in, they'll sit with them for a while and figure out kind of where they're coming from and what knowledge base they have, and then kind of tailor the educational experience to that. And one of the things that's really cool that they do is they have German students, it's optional for everybody, but that can come and stay at the facility for multiple days. And that's kind of how they really get to absorb that information as best as possible. And one of the things that we actually got to talk to students and teachers and things that were there, and it brought students. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is a big part of the mission there is that they're not trying to make people feel guilty, but they're trying to make people recognize the responsibility. And we actually talked to like a 15-year-old German student who, when we were asking her about it, she said, it's not, I don't have to feel bad because I'm German, but because I'm German, it's my responsibility to make sure something like this never happens again. And I really think that's a big point of their educational mission, is not guilt, not like punishing people, but really focusing on like the humanity of the people that died there, the humanity of the whole situation, and how it's our responsibility to address that in a responsible way and face it head on. And that's something that I think like our country could really take a lesson from, is to face what we've done head on and learn from it in a constructive way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we spoke a lot about, I think we were told this before arriving, but after having stayed on site and been there for multiple days, we really started to understand the magnitude of actually staying there for more than like one day, how much that benefited our experience, and the German students as well. Holger, the director of education at the memorial, spoke a lot about how people will visit and kind of be focusing on like that guilt aspect, and it doesn't really get us anywhere, and just kind of scratching the surface of what they actually want people to take away from their experience. So kind of breaking through that emotional layer and getting down to the cognitive level of visiting the memorial and going with a guide through the grounds, visiting the exhibitions. They said, like, when people come for like 3 hours, it's not really, it's not impactful. They're kind of just having some emotions that aren't really getting to the root of many things. And they also spoke a lot about the guides. Reno was saying their guides and all of their staff, they're so incredibly intelligent, but their guides have to go through rigorous training. If you saw the list of things tests they have to do and all of the qualifications they have to have, it's as if you're like applying for your PhD or something. Like it's I mean, it was crazy. But that is so important. Like not doing your research and just jumping into something, it does so much damage if you have a tour guide that doesn't really know what they're talking about. It doesn't know the factual things about it, and that can completely ruin your experience.
Yeah. I'd also kind of say that they're focused, and maybe this is because we were American and came with an American perspective, but there is a lot of focus on the Holocaust was also tailored to racism, and the Holocaust wasn't, not everybody who was perpetrated by the Holocaust was Jewish. It was political prisoners and people who were gay and people who weren't the perfect German. And so they talked a lot about understanding that too and kind of expanding your perspective on what the Holocaust was and is. And I thought that was super cool because there were a lot of things that we prepare for, but Buchenwald didn't have gas chambers. Only Auschwitz had gas chambers. And I personally didn't know that, but going there, they put a lot of emphasis on just the truth and kind of eliminating these preconceived notions about what people think about the Holocaust.
I think it was like really interesting also just seeing how they approach each different program and how it's like it's not like a cookie cutter like program for every single person. They'll like gauge how much the educate like that specific institution knows or whatever the school knows, and then they'll build like a little program each day, and then it's like they'll do specific little classes or they'll do seminars. And I thought it was really interesting that they have like a lot of multimedia aspects, because I wouldn't expect, you know, a former concentration camp to have that, where it's like instead of making like little presentation or poster boards like they used to have the students do, now they're going to have them make like little short videos, like, you know, like social media style type videos, not for social media, but, you know, that like kind of aspect, just because it gauges the students to learn more and they're more interested in that type of work.
Dr. Sun, could you talk a little bit about, Reno and Brooke both mentioned the kind of the concern about visitors feeling that guilt, especially German visitors. Could you talk a little bit about the culture of remembrance that is dominant throughout German culture?
I'd be glad to. Yeah, the Germans have since the 1970s done, I think, a really excellent job in fostering a culture of remembrance and responsibility in contrast to feeling guilty. You know, there's a huge difference between responsibility and guilt. I think I really want to press home on this point because the far right in Germany wants to diminish Holocaust remembrance and general remembrance, or relativize and normalize the Nazi period, or just say, oh, that was just an aberration. And they're leaning into a concept of remembrance that equals guilt, which is not the intention of Buchenwald or any of the other memorial places, and the German educational curriculum makes a very clear distinction between that. I think that's a powerful lesson, and probably one that transfers outside of Germany as well. You know, and every country has its issues and its difficult pasts, and I think the Germans are not perfect, but once they began, they've done, I think, a really good job. I would say that Buchenwald is an interesting case because it's located in eastern Germany, so it's in the former East German, which was a communist state. And the German Democratic Republic, as it was called.
It's located right around near here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the state of Thuringia. And this is important because the former communist state didn't really have to engage in deep they didn't recognize the Holocaust as a separate and really important issue. They didn't recognize it with its own special memorials because the reason for being of the East German state was they were the communist state. Communists had resisted Nazis, therefore they were the anti-fascist state. They didn't have a problem. And so Buchenwald was actually a shrine for the East Germans celebrating communist resistance fighters who were imprisoned and who died there. And so they had pilgrimages for the youth groups and so on, but it was a different target group. So I don't know how deeply you talked with Holger and the staff about that, but once Germany reunified, there would have had to have been a major curricular change for the education
Right.
center there.
I think it was interesting talking to Holger specifically about that because he grew up being taught the East German curriculum. And so it was very much like he had to move outside what he was taught to make sure that, because they minimize, they focus so much on the communist resistance that they minimize the actual, like, the murder of Jewish populations, the murder of gay people, they minimized everything in order to kind of paint this picture of like a communist resistance thing. And there's even kind of controversy at the memorial because there's like certain, that's one of the giant like monuments built by the communists. But they also, there's a lot of controversy because some parts of the Buchenwald Memorial, they even tacked on a facility that's like a recreation. It's like not even like, wasn't even at that location on Buchenwald, but it was a spot where communist prisoners were killed. So they were recreating a spot. And there's a lot of controversy because it's like, on one hand, that is kind of misinformation. It's like, this is like the communist propaganda about what happened at Buchenwald, but it's also a historical element in and of itself. This is something you can point to be like, this is how the East Germans thought about this versus what we know like the facts are. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect of Buchenwald in general.
One note, you guys, we need to speak louder for all the people in the back. Are you guys hearing us okay? So everybody just use your outside
broadcast
voices.
Okay, Brooke, that's just it.
So we talked a little bit about this giant memorial that Rena was just talking about. It's a good segue to ask you guys about everything that you saw and took in at Buchenwald from a visual standpoint. What images or locations stood out to you the most? Like, what do you kind of just hold and remember? And why do you think that is?
Well, Buchenwald is huge. Like, you look at it and it's like, you can't even see the end of it. You can't see the back barbed wire fence. It's so big. But there's this big clock tower that you walk through, that the prisoners walked through these gates right here. And then right here is like what they would call roll call square, where every morning all of the prisoners had to line up and their names were called one by one by one by one every single morning to make sure to see who died and whatnot. And so yeah, this is like the huge camp, and that's a bunch of prisoners in Roll Call Square. But they were looking at this gate, and the words on the gate said, "Every man for himself," basically, or like, right?
To like
to each his own.
to eat, or like you get what you deserve.
Yeah, and so they're looking at this gate while they're being like diminished as people and looked at as animals, and so they're standing there for hours on end just looking at this saying and wondering like who they are anymore. Their entire sense of individuality is gone, and I don't even know how you process that as a person. And so being there and looking at this gate and imagining all of these prisoners there was just very touching and very surreal.
I think for me personally, the roll call square was more meaningful, or one of the most meaningful aspects visually. Just kind of what Lauren was touching on, where it was like, seeing like all these people and like how they're lined up every day and just like who died. It's just like, I was reading more about it, and like the more interviews we conducted, we learned that like they would stand there for 3 days at a time. They wouldn't eat. They wouldn't, they would die as they're standing.
Yeah, people would have. I mean, if somebody you knew had died in the barrack, you would have to drag that person out
Yeah,
to
so they-
Roll Call
Like, hold
Square.
them up.
So
Yeah.
they'd be accounted for, and you guys wouldn't be punished for them being missing. So that just really stood out to me, and it's just so like just such an empty space, and seeing like the former floodlights, and it really impacted me.
Yeah. I think 3, I mean, everything is sticks in my head very vividly, but I think 3 things really stick out like pretty much every day. One of the main things is just the fact that about 50%, I believe, of the original structures are no longer there. There was like a bombing raid that destroyed a lot of the structures, and also the SS officers intentionally destroyed a lot because they were anticipating liberation. So it's sometimes hard to kind of visualize those actual things. Pictures definitely help, but I think also after learning that, Holger was touching on how because there's so much missing, it was very easy for the Nazis or Nazi Germany to create false narratives and pretty much like paint a picture like for whatever was going to help them, because there wasn't a lot there, and until a lot of evidence came out, they could kind of say whatever and people would believe them because there was nothing to see. That kind of leads into my next thing. We visited the depot, as they call it, where they keep all of the artifacts. There was like a ton of different things that prisoners made for the SS officers, things that the prisoners brought with them to the camp when they just thought they were going to work there, and things that really stuck with me that helped me humanize these like individual prisoners, like their wallets, their rings, like that got to me more than, looking at the Roll Call Square and like visualizing it. Like you can definitely try and do that, and with pictures it helps, but seeing those actual objects, it's very emotional, and it's like that was someone's ring, like that sort of thing. So that stuck out to me. And then the last thing, when we were going through the crematorium, I don't believe these were original urns, but they had some just kind of, I think, to speak on this, but in the very beginning, when they would be getting rid of bodies, they would send urns back to relatives with just mixed ashes, saying it was their loved one. Like, and to this day, I mean, they still believe that, and I think that just is to receive that and to think you have your loved one with you, and it's just a complete lie.
I think actually this image here is actually, it looks kind of just like a random image of the park, but it's actually a really striking one for me. So this area in the forefront here is a zoo. This was a former zoo. So SS officers could take their family, their girlfriend, like things like that, and go sit at this zoo, and there was like deer and little bears, and they could like pet them and things. And right on that other side is the crematorium where they burnt the bodies of the prisoners. So you had a zoo here, and then you have a fence, and you have people who are being treated worse than those animals right across the street. And so that's something that really stuck out to me, and I think that's one thing, like when Ray was mentioning that a lot of people in East Germany kind of tried to absolve themselves of the responsibility for these actions. It is fully not the case. These were people who, these were community members. Community members would come here, sit at the zoo. Like, one of the points they made that I think was really interesting is a lot of the SS officers were like 16, 17-year-old boys. And so they were given all of these like social benefits, like they could drink early, they could get married early, they could move out of their parents' house, they could do all that. And they basically exchanged that to become SS officers, and they lived like a perfectly normal life. And the prisoners walked through the town to get to the camp. They were like, there was no part of German society that wasn't implicated in some way. Even if you weren't directly involved, you benefited from forced labor camps. You benefited from these prisoners. And I think this was just a really good indication of how disconnected they were from the Jewish population and the prisoner population as humans. They really did not consider them as human. They compartmentalized it in a way where they could sit and have a fun family day at the zoo, where right across is, are people starving to death and being worked to death. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that there's an art gallery at the memorial, and it's in a building that used to be used for like sanitizing people. So like when they would shave them and take all their things, they've repurposed that at the memorial into an art gallery that has prisoner art from like when they were actually in the prison, and also people doing art after the fact, kind of trying to express like what they felt and what they saw. And that was honestly, of all the things we saw, that was actually where I got the most emotional, was at the art gallery, because there's something about the fact that like even in these situations, these are still people. People are still trying to express themselves artistically. They're still trying to, like, even at the risk of having to, like, steal art supplies and hide them because you're going to get punished or killed if you get found, people are still making art and people are still creating. And I think that's something that really humanizes the victims, because you can really feel that humanity when you see something someone documented through their art.
Is there anything, I was going to ask you if you wanted to talk more about the sign on the gate, but I also would just like to, if there's any additional perspective you'd like to provide on some of the things the students just said.
Could you put the sign back up there?
Yeah.
So, Jedem das Seine does roughly translate, you get what you deserve, or it's part of, I think it's important to know that the Nazis loved to put up little mottos on their ironwork at the entrance to camps, and even in the undressing rooms for showers, telling people to stay clean and work hard. They're always a very finger-wagging sort of culture. And the most famous one of these probably is at Auschwitz. Many of you have seen that, where it says Arbeit macht frei, which means work will set you free, which is a lie. Everything the Nazis do is a lie, because it was a vast slave labor camp. And I just find that I haven't penetrated fully into the Nazi mind, but this is one of the fascinating things to me, because not only, I think it was either Reno or Brooke was saying, as you're looking at this as a prisoner, it dehumanizes you, or has the potential to dehumanize you, or say, yeah, you deserve this, buddy. But it's also something that the guards would have seen every day, and I think it creates this strange moral imperative or moral legitimation for what they're doing, right? So they all get what they deserve, no problem. We're just administering a just and necessary system. So, I have not cracked the code on this, but I find it truly fascinating. The other thing I think about the park, the little zoo that you mentioned. This is also something that I suppose to perpetrate a genocide, you have to be able to compartmentalize really well. And so we have the zoo here at Buchenwald. I know at Auschwitz, which had also a slave labor camp, we've been discovering music that the Germans had prisoners compose for them, and they had prisoner orchestras perform this music. It's very light, fluffy dance music from the 40s, foxtrots and things like this. But you have this bizarre scene of SS officers, SS personnel dancing to they called them tea dances, right? A Sunday afternoon tea dance where, everyone's dressed nicely and you're dancing and you're relaxing within a mile or so of incredible squalor or even gas chambers and crematoria. So I think that this is one of the things which is really at the heart of this concentration camp universe is the Germans' ability to just compartmentalize and say this is one part of life, this is other part of life, and there's no problem. It's just amazing.
I remember one thing Holger Obarius said to us, and he said that all Germans want to think that their family was part of the resistance, right? And that really, as you were saying, most were implicated in some way, and really had to do what they had to do to survive, even if they didn't agree, right, with what was going on. So you guys, your stories are focused, at least in part, on the namesake of our college, Edward R. Murrow, right, and his famous broadcast report from Buchenwald, which was broadcast on April 15, 1945. What did you guys see as the effect of his report, and how did that affect your own thoughts about the power of the media to disseminate information and have an impact on society?
Well, he was there on the 12th and walked around and got tours from a bunch of the newly freed prisoners, and then took 3 days to mull it over because he couldn't broadcast something because he was so traumatized, and then broadcast on the 15th. But in today's media, you would go to a place, an event, and you would just broadcast right there. There's no sitting with your thoughts, there's no mulling it over. It's just immediate, so you can post on social media, so you can break the news. There's no humanization behind it, except for the fact that I want to get this story out to my local media outlet. But Edward R. Murrow had to sit with it for 3 days, and his voice was shaking and he was trembling on the radio because he just couldn't fathom what he had just seen. And I think that's just a huge difference from 1945, 80 years later, compared to today's media. And granted, there wasn't social media, there was no Instagram, there was no TikTok, Twitter, whatever, but also people trusted their broadcaster and their local radio man a lot more than they trust the news today. And so nobody was fretting that he took 3 days to put out this broadcast. But now if someone hears a story from a media outlet, then they're like, oh my god, why isn't CBS reporting on this? Why isn't this outlet reporting on this? It's just a question of who else is going to report on this? But back then everyone just trusted their local radio man and trusted what he was going to say. But I don't think that's the same in today's media at all.
Yeah.
Sure.
He was one of the most trusted voices of his time. So this was his broadcast. It was one of the first accounts of the impact of the Holocaust and the horrors and the atrocities that had been committed at Buchenwald in particular. But this was, for Americans, this was one of the first documented accounts that they could fully believe. There had been a lot of rumor, and in dealing with that discomfort of it obviously being a lot to digest, hearing these things, you want to believe they're not true. So that is what a lot of people did. They just, until they were given legitimate proof that it was no longer deniable. That is what a lot of people did in America too. And I think, Murrow's report was extremely impactful. It became a historical document. And without reports like his and photographers like Lee Miller, she took amazing photographs that were, Holger was saying, without photographs like that and reports like Murrow's, many people didn't believe things until they saw or heard it. That's just a fact. And without them, he was just saying that there would be so much more room for denial and ignorance than there is today. Obviously, there's so much. We're still dealing with denial of the Holocaust, which is absurd. But without those, it would have been even worse, which is mind-boggling.
Yeah. You guys should watch the movie Lee if
Yeah.
you haven't. It's really
Lee
good.
Miller. It's about Lee Miller. It's very good.
Can you guys hear in the back? Are you still having trouble hearing? No, not really.
Sorry, I don't have a broadcast voice.
So other things that happened as a result of Murrow's report, at least in part, were that members of Congress came over, there was a demand that members of Congress come over and see what was actually happening, right, in the concentration camps. And General Patton, I think, forced members of Weimar and other towns to actually go and see what had been right 5 miles up the road from their very normal lives.
Yeah, and I would say that Murrow's report was kind of a voice, like, for Americans, because not everybody can travel to Weimar to see Buchenwald, but it is true that the surrounding citizens of Weimar, there's photos of them all standing around. There were piles of corpses that the SS officers didn't get around to burning when Murrow went to do his report, when the liberation happened, and in the days following when they did have those surrounding residents come see it. So his report just does a fantastic, a chilling job. Like, it's not a nice thing to hear, but it does a beautiful job of illustrating the horrors. So it's not a good thing, but he does a very good job for the people that were not there to see it.
I think also, just in the interest of like this kind of conversation about humanizing the people there, he talked to a bunch of individuals there, and they kind of gave their stories, and I think that was a really impactful thing. And actually, we were lucky enough, the staff at Buchenwald actually put together a presentation for us where they actually looked up and found the records of all the people he talked to and mentioned by name during his broadcast. And there was one gentleman who his brother found out he was alive from that broadcast, and then Murrow actually helped him get to the United States, and he ended up being a successful doctor. I think you actually talked to his...
Well, yeah, so, he mentioned many different individual prisoners in his broadcast, and that's why we are able to still tell their individual stories. But one of them, Dr. Paul Heller, Murrow stayed in contact with him following his report after the liberation, and was actually able to help him immigrate to the U.S. He became a very successful doctor at the University of Illinois, and his daughter is also a professor now today, and I'm speaking with her on Sunday, this coming Sunday. So kind of just about how, that the impact of Murrow's report, it helps tell those individual stories and help with remembrance and just keeping alive the legacy of those prisoners.
Do you want to add anything to put in perspective the impact of some of those early media reports?
They were enormous for the Western public and for the American public specifically. So it's in mid-April of 1945 when a number of camps were liberated almost on a daily basis. So the British liberated Bergen-Belsen. General Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald, just a few days before Murrow's broadcast, right? And so there's sort of this cascade of news coming out to the American public. Eisenhower was so horrified that he actually, as the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Western Europe, he actually was instrumental in getting media and congressional representatives to come over and witness this. I think at the time, Life magazine was one of the biggest publications. Everyone knew Life, and I think their photographer was Margaret Burke.
Margaret
Yes,
Burke,
yeah.
right.
Mhm.
Right, and so she was there at Buchenwald and took some iconic pictures. And photography is so important. Those of you who have studied the Holocaust, you know about Elie Wiesel. He was a teenager, and he is captured in one of Margaret Burke White's photos in the bunks right after liberation. I will say also, because I work with some students who study veterans, and liberating a camp was the most traumatizing experience that veterans experienced, bar none. So these are combat veterans. Oftentimes they'd been in combat from D-Day, June 1944 until April 1945. They'd seen everything on the battlefield, but they were still traumatized by entering the camps and seeing the masses of bodies and the way in which prisoners were killed. And for many of them, it traumatized them on a lifelong basis. So if you're not, nothing can prepare you for it probably, but even combat veterans had that same reaction as the man off the street, which I think is really telling.
Yeah, and often those veterans didn't know what they were about to see. Yes, they were in combat and they'd seen things, but you don't know you're going to stumble on a concentration camp and liberate it. So they didn't really sign up to see the things they saw either.
No one had really prepared them.
Yeah.
There's no special preparation.
I'll also say that the prisoners didn't sign up to be
Yeah,
subjected
yeah.
to anything
Yeah.
either.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
it's just a really, really twisted thing.
Yeah, we talked to early on in our preparation, we talked to one of Dr. Sun's former students who's now completing a master's degree in history, and she's collecting veteran stories, specifically the stories of liberators. And Lauren and Brooke wrote us a profile of her that's actually going to appear in the Spokesman Review, hopefully in a week or so. But I remember her telling us that years later, one of the veterans that she interviewed, burned himself and instantly was transported because of the smell of, and I'm sorry, but because of the smell of burning flesh. And many of the liberators talked about that being one of the most haunting things, just because it was such a dominant thing. So we quickly have run out of time, and so we want to use this last 5 minutes for questions. I'm sorry it's only 5 minutes. I also want to apologize. I'm embarrassed. I said Patton when I meant Eisenhower, so I get my generals mixed up. But so let's have a question. Yeah.
So when you guys went over there to Buchenwald, I was wondering, was there a difference in the way that prisoners were treated based on, their race, sexual orientation, and the fact that they were Jewish, or were they all just seen as prisoners? And is that different representation, is that something that is shown at Buchenwald, maybe Romani culture, or gay people, or different aspects of that, is that shown over there as well?
There's actually kind of almost like a strict hierarchy amongst the prisoners. So there was Buchenwald has the main camp, and there were certain bunkers that were better or than others. There was obviously the German prisoners were treated better unless they were Jewish or gay, but there was actually the majority of the Jewish populace was put into what was called the Little Camp, which that was actually fenced off on its own. So there was the whole main camp, and then there was a camp tacked onto that was literally made out of horse stables and stuff, something that used to hold
2,000.
Yeah,
each horse stable held up to 2,000 prisoners.
Exactly. And so that was even at Buchenwald, that was even more horrifying conditions and stuff like that. So they had a really, the Germans are the Nazis were this really weird bureaucratic group too. Everything was meticulously labeled. Every person that came in was categorized.
Mm-hmm.
Every person
their triangles.
Yeah, they had different shapes on their clothing based on where they were from, what they're, and they had prisoners that they rounded up people that they did considered work shy individuals. So they were even rounding up homeless people and then categorizing them as something else, and or people that refused to work in these guys. So there was actually a lot of almost social stratification within the camp itself.
Yeah, and Dr. Paul Heller, for example, he was a doctorate student at the time of when he was taken to the prisons. He was a prisoner at 5 different concentration camps, I believe for 6 years in total, and yeah, so they had like they're categorized like different color triangle or something, but he was actually arrested for like anti-Nazi like ideals or like a mindset. So they could, and then that would be your thing. But it also, another important thing to note is if you had like a special skill, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but like if you were a doctor or you were like a photographer or something that could benefit the SS troops, you would stay alive for longer because you were more valuable.
Yeah, they would. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I remember Holger also told us that, like, it wasn't always just mainly Jewish people in the camp. It would flip around. Like, sometimes it'd be mainly, like, Soviet prisoners. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't always just, like, targeting just Jewish people. They would, like, kind of mix around. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that Murrow broadcast available?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's, if you look up Murrow's Buchenwald broadcast, it's, it's on YouTube. It's on the American Holocaust Museum's website, and it's very easily accessible. We tried to use it in our work, but it's copyrighted by CBS. So.
Was it like a special report coming tonight at 9 p.m., or was it, okay, it's the 6 o'clock radio news, and it just kind of popped up? I mean, today you would get ads telling you that this was going to happen, and I'm just curious how it was presented, or do we know?
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure, but in Murrow's first paragraph opening, he says, I pray you to hear what I'm about to say. The horrors were unimaginable, basically. Yeah. And then at the very end, he says, I still have no words.
Yeah.
I pray you to believe what I have just told you.
I believe it did just kind of pop up, because he also says, if you're, eating lunch, stop eating lunch. He says, yeah.
It was a regular radio broadcast, because he reported regularly during World War II, and so he was, I believe, embedded with the 3rd Armored Division at the time, and
the
he
3rd
got...
Army is the 3rd and the 6th Armored Division.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Together, yeah.
Okay. So he got there with the Liberators, but the day after Liberation, and then, like Lauren said, it took him 3 days to sort of control his emotions before he put it out. So, yeah.
Talking about how emotional it was for the vets and for Murrow, how was it for you guys? How do you emotionally and mentally prepare for that? You spent a couple of months talking with the director of the camp, or education of the camp, and then how do you come back from that? We think about international trips as a really fun and adventurous thing, and you guys took on something that was definitely not that, or not just that. So how do you all kind of work through that on your own?
I think we did a lot of research, and I think because we knew about the trip for a pretty long period of time, I know we all watched a lot of documentaries, a lot of different films that Dr. Sun suggested, and Holger suggested as well. We read a lot of things, and I think, in my personal opinion, I read, there was one book I was reading, the Buchenwald Report. It's very, very hard read. And I think that kind of prepared me for what I was going to see. So I was I think more conditioned to go into that environment, because I'd kind of read some pretty awful things before, which isn't probably a great answer, but yeah.
I think with me personally, I did prepare and I did as much as I could. I did, I had a support system and I did talk everything out. And even at the camp, we did talk amongst each other and work with each other. But regardless of that, I did have a pretty difficult time because I had family in concentration camps, my great-grandparents and my grandma. So it was hard, just kind of having that mindset being this is what they endured. So I think out of everyone, I had a little bit of a harder time, but just being able to work through that and just working with this great team and being able to live through Murrow's legacy and reporting the 80th liberation is just, it's a great honor. And so I think that's ultimately what has me feel better about everything. It makes me, in the hard times, think better about it.
Yeah, I will shout out our team. We got really close, and I really couldn't have done it without these 3 other students. We were just we have the same exact humor, and like it was very refreshing to be around people who knew what I was going through. But I think I had the hardest time coming back. For a week, I kind of felt like a shell of a human being, because I would be like, 4 days ago it was my second day at Buchenwald, and I don't even know what I was thinking then, and I don't know what I'm thinking now. And so I think coming back was honestly the hardest part for me, because then we had to write about it, and we're still writing about it. And so it's just kind of a continuation of what I saw and what I'm feeling.
I think one of the cool things about Buchenwald in general is because of like the educational mission, and because they do a lot to memorialize the people, that for me, you can get overwhelmed with like the horror of everything, but to me it felt almost like a cemetery. So it's like they're also honoring these people. Like in the crematorium where these bodies were burnt, now families can send in like plaques and gravestones, so they actually have a place to visit for their family that died there. There's like even like there's a couple pictures of this like memorial that has the names of all the countries of people that died at the camp, which could be such a solemn thing. But if you touch it, it is heated at all times to the exact temperature of a human body. And so it really drives home that like the human nature and the mourning nature, but it's, I think like it comes in waves for me on like how like emotional and heavy that was. But there's also, if you focus on the human nature of the people, and as far as journalists go, like our duty to like do them justice and tell their story in a way that's compelling and also can like reflect what they went through in an accurate way. And I think that sort of human aspect is really essential.
That's probably as much time as we have, right? So, thank you guys.